I figured I should just start with my New York Times passes, because this always comes up if I've been to the New York Times, if they're talking to me. And I have talked to the New York Times. And it's been a very interesting conversation. I'm alive, so I've talked to them about 4 times. And the question, some of the questions that I've heard, I can't say necessarily they were directly from the Times kind of editors or anybody, but it's kind of why the Times, what motivated this project. And so I put these first because I want to kind of get them out of the way. I think that unfortunately the conversations about counter-narratives, and I'm guilty of this as well, has started to orient itself around the Times. And while it's important to maybe consider why I'm using this kind of mainstream liberal paper to do this project, I actually think the genesis of the project actually points to the reader a bit more than the institution. But I will share that when I've seen them, I've been critical, honest about journalism and language as violence and racism and contemporary media, and so they're here to kind of get them out of the way, and to kind of answer what usually is at least the first question that I have during Q&A is, are you talking to the New York Times? And so yes, I've talked to the New York Times. I didn't follow directions in turning my pass, so I have a little pile. But yeah, I started this project in part as a pushback to news, and as I've kind of grown to understand my own work, I've started to think a little bit more critically about what it means to challenge kind of mainstream narratives. So I'm gonna launch into some Foucault, but I'm gonna warn you that this is amateur hour for me in some ways. I have been reading Jose Medina, who actually makes Foucault accessible for me. So this quote is particularly important for me, kind of introducing you guys to some kind of older versions of media. When it comes to knowledge of the past and the power associated with it, this battle involves resisting the omissions and distortions of official histories, returning to lost voices and forgotten experiences, relating to the past from the perspective of the present in an alternative, out of the mainstream way. And I guess if I could crib that, that might be a definition for counter-narratives. I'm sharing these particular clips with you because they're relevant in terms of a historical context, but also because they kind of foreground the work that I'll share with you from my own series. This is a 1941 piece from Life. It came out, I think, December 22nd, which is probably exactly 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor. This piece seeks to inform the reader how to tell Japs from the Chinese. If you see the photo, there's kind of markings on the face to try to explain to you how to distinguish between particular features. And the first line, I don't think you can read it, is that people are kind of showing a distressing inability to tell the difference between Chinese and Japanese people. This is supposed to be, I guess, a tutorial to give you a sense of where journalism has been. This is a cartoon. The welfare queen stereotype is one of the most enduring, I guess, stereotypes that we have is kind of introduced kind of more officially in 1976 from Reagan. It persists now, even though Black women are not the majority of women on welfare. It's actually white women. I put this one in here, and I think it's important. I toyed with maybe taking it out, in part because I like to think about language and violence in journalism, and how Black and brown people typically get framed as animals, or with kind of like animalistic kind of features and behaviors. But I also wanted to touch base with this one because this one's very critical to me right now as we're in the Me Too phase, right? And so what's really essential about this is that during the week, the 2 weeks that this happened, you know, the Central Park jogger was a white jogger who was raped in Central Park. there were 28 other rapes. 24 of those happened to Latino and Black women. One of them, which was 2 weeks after this event occurred, happened to a woman in Brooklyn, a Black woman in Brooklyn. She was accosted by two men, raped on a rooftop, and actually thrown 50 feet over. She survived. I think she landed on her feet, actually, but her legs were crushed. Almost no coverage. So one of the things I want you to really think about, kind of as I talk about my work, is like, what is in front of you and how we can kind of shift our gaze to think about what might be behind that. And so this is a really important one for me to use. This one, I mean, you can kind of see what I'm going to point out. If you were, I'm an 80s baby, so I was probably 12 when this was going down. This particular cover in 1994, which featured O.J. Simpson's mugshot, was almost on every cover of every magazine, every newspaper this week. Time magazine actually digitally darkened the image, and to journalism school's credit, this is one of the examples they show us when they talk about manipulating and kind of problematic stereotypes. But mostly, I bring these to your attention because they touch on distortion. And part of what I'm curious about, or what I'm trying to tease out with the Counternarrative series, is how a dominant institution, through distortion, can kind of set the tone for how we think about others, how we think about race, how we think about gender, how we think about sexuality, how we think about Blackness. And so the Counternarrative series attempts to make attempts to kind of resist that through particular strategies. Bell Hook talks about this in Black Looks. She has a chapter on oppositional gaze. Even in the worst circumstances of domination, the ability to manipulate one's gaze in the face of structures of domination, the ability to contain it, opens the possibility of agency. And so I think the Counternarrative series is actually an opportunity for revision and resistance, and so I approach the work that way. Part of what I want to talk about as I go into the Counternarratives project is the process. And the process involves me, I usually look for an entry point there's a journalistic hiccup, right? And so if you think back to the 4 slides that I share with you, the OJ, you can look at that as kind of actual literal distortion. You can look at the one that's comparing Chinese and Japanese as actual false narrative, racist stereotypical comparisons, false equivalencies. If you look at the one containing the Central Park rapist, you can think about that one as omission, right? So part of what I find is how women function in journalism is through omission. They're actually absent. So it's kind of an interesting thing of how do you contend with something that's actually not there, right? And so being invisible doesn't actually mean that there's no narrative forming. There is one that's forming in an absence. So I'm really curious about that in this work as well. Anyway, so I started this, I got this idea as it's kind of been long brewing, but when it popped up probably in a most salient manner, I was a journalism student at Columbia, and part of the work that we had to do was we needed to read 3 papers a day. We needed to read the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Daily News. And the idea was to try to think critically about how papers writing about the same topics approach the content. And so the Daily News, as you all know, is maybe $1 a day. Opens like a book, really short stories, kind of. The New York Times is definitely more in-depth news. It's considered kind of the official record, right? And so I want you to think about that term too. When we're starting to think about what narratives we believe to be true, the New York Times is seen as this paper that is very, very critical to kind of what we believe to be fact. And then the Wall Street Journal is the Wall Street Journal. It's definitely a more numerical paper. It has a bend that leans towards that particular community. Anyway, during my second year, there were a rash, and I guess continuing now, of police shootings. But at the time, it was really critical because Trayvon Martin had been murdered. I want to say it was 2012. Forgive me if I mixed them up. There were so many. But what I was starting to notice, my friends and I had this really unfortunate and kind of morbid thing we would do is after there was a police shooting, we would kind of gather at a bar and we would drink and we would just talk shit about it, right? And one of the things that I was always really curious about is what was being left out in the reportage, right? How little twists of words and language could actually maybe shift our viewpoint. And I think in August of last year, when Corinne Gaines was murdered, one of the really critical things that I was curious about, I think the Washington Post had a title that says, Mother shot by cops cradling kid and gun. And I was arguing with people like, they should say she's in her own home. This is like a very important thing. What does it mean to think about a woman in her home protecting herself? And if that word is missing, maybe it changes things. And so that's kind of where the manipulation started. I started kind of tweaking titles. Anyway, this article, but in J school is interesting. You're learning about this field, and for the most part, the things that you learn, they make sense. They're true, but there's something off. And I think I don't remember the exact racial constitution of my class, but there definitely were a ton of colored folks. But I remember the time thinking something's off, and not exactly knowing what it was because all the rules were being followed and everything was being checkboxed, right? And so it has to be an institutional issue. So kind of fast forward when I started to think about doing the work, one of the articles that always stood out to me was the Michael Brown No Angel article. You guys know this article? Because I feel like I don't have to go into what it's about. So in August of 2014, Michael Brown was shot 6 times by Officer Darren Wilson in Ferguson, St. Louis, Ferguson, Missouri. And the New York Times ran a 2-column piece about this event and that compared them. And so that was kind of one of the first ones that I pulled up. And one of the reasons that I identified this for this project is because I thought that it represented kind of what is a false equivalency. Like technically, this follows all of the rules because journalism's biggest bend is that we need to really think about objectivity. And so everyone should kind of in some ways be kind of weighted equally. But what happens when we're not all equal? You know, how do we contend with that in journalism? And so this was one of the first ones that I pulled up. And so as I was thinking about how to kind of work through this publicly, I was actually working on Instagram. So I was kind of working digitally through the work and just started kind of crossing out different words to kind of tease out the language that I thought was problematic. And if you guys, of course, you can kind of see through my handwriting, but the original title was 2 Lives at Crossroads in Ferguson. And the title assigned to Darren Wilson, and this work is in the outside in the courtyard. A low-profile officer with unsettled early days. And then the John Ligon piece was a teenager grappling with problems and promise. And so I started there just kind of trying to tease out and kind of edit particular words. And what's interesting is when I was talking with the Times, I actually got a chance to engage with the writer just a little bit. I thanked him for this article because it's kind of launched a little bit of a movement for me. But I think what happens, at least with journalism, is that the solution becomes diversity, right? We hear this kind of like liberal word being tossed around a lot. Oh, we can solve this if we make it more diverse. But if you notice, like at least 2 of the authors on this are minorities. So I think they're kind of working within a particular structure that's pretty hard to escape. So I kind of got this idea, and it was in part from looking at work about marginalia, right? This kind of idea that you can kind of immerse yourself into text and kind of think more critically about it and engage it from a deeper level if you actually marked it up. And so I started kind of working through this article bit by bit. And first, this is me kind of, I'm in InDesign, so if people want to get a sense of how I'm working, I started the project working through it digitally. And so one of the things that I did is just kind of pointed to certain things and ideas to kind of question everything, right? So if I think back to at least Jose Medina's interpretation of Foucault, right? Because I don't want to claim that I actually really get Foucault. I need a translator for that. But one of the things that I started to do was kind of mark up all of the things that maybe I would question if I were reading the article just as an outsider, right? What does it mean to use the word suburb when you talk about blacks? Like, what does it mean to mention race at a particular point of the article? This article references that Mike Brown used drugs and he used alcohol. What does it mean to actually throw those terms out? And so the idea is to kind of question everything. And so I started to kind of work through bits of the article, and I tried to think, what does it mean? What would it mean for me to share this, to kind of impose this type of viewpoint on another viewer, right? Because a lot of times when you're writing notes and you're thinking critically about language and structure, it's a private endeavor. And so I was trying to figure out, how do I push this outward? So at first I kind of barked on these things and I shared them on social media, and I introduced kind of the idea of a counter-narrative. And so this is some of the behind-the-scenes work of me kind of marking through all of the articles. It's the same article, but what I've done is that I've moved away from working digitally. I've decided that this may be something that's a little bit more subjective and physical. So I actually go into InDesign and I copy the article kind of visually. I kind of try to eyeball it. If it's a really hard layout, I measure it. But for the most part, I've been successful just trying to figure out what the font size might be for a larger work. And so I started working through this, and at first, admittedly, I only wanted to think about it as someone trained in journalism. Like, the whole goal of the project was to critique the field, right? I hadn't really thought about it as a revolutionary act, or as setting the stage for people to kind of push back against a dominant narrative. And so this is me working through trying to figure out what photos I should use and laying the foundation for what a counter-narrative is. This is 2 of the versions. This is another 2 versions. In all, it took 13 iterations to get to the version that you encounter in the courtyard. And so people are always really curious kind of what a counter-narrative does, right? And so what the rules of a counter-narrative is, what they are. I find an article that has like a journalistic hiccup, and then adhering to the tenets of the field, I adjust it and I manipulate it in a way to reveal another perspective, right? Because the idea is that a dominant institution like the New York Times has the power to kind of set the stage for what we believe to be fact. And if somehow within that, I can kind of shift things and manipulate it in a way to reveal another truth, and that's as a person who's a minority, as a person at the margins, that in itself is kind of a power and resistance. And so that's what I've been thinking about. And so when it got to this stage, I was at an impasse. Kind of, how do I move from working in the text in my studio to something more forcefully public, that's beyond social media, right? Because that's how this happened at first. And so this is referring again to the same Foucault article. Insurrections involve the difficult labor of mobilizing scattered, marginalized publics and of tapping into the critical potential of their dejected experiences and memories. And so as I was thinking about how to introduce it to the public, I wanted to kind of create an opportunity for people to kind of collectively push back against this dominant narrative. And like, how do I do that? And one of the things that I thought about at first was that I just redo the paper. I felt like I would just kind of reprint the article in the paper and distribute it. And I decided that in itself maybe was very confusing. So I decided to post them up as public prints, and to try to glean from that how people could deal with them. And so the left side of the counter-narrative, so I don't know if you guys gotten a chance to see the Olympic threat one, right? But the one that's on the left is actually my reproduction of what I've seen in the paper. And so the rule of that is that particular article needs to stay, at least for words, for the most part, very much appearance-wise how it showed up in the paper. And I'm free to mark that up, to put instructions on it, and then the next version is actually the redo of it. And so if you look at the Usain Bolt one, there's text on one side that's kind of instructing you, that's kind of arguing back against some of the language, and the right side is supposed to be a sort of a corrective, right? And so the Michael Brown one was the first one. I'm sharing this one with you because something surprising happened when I posted it up. Now, if you can see this is Bedford and Madison in Bed-Stuy. I think this actually is still there. I decided to post the two up. I opted for very simple language where I took out all of the words except for basically Darren Wilson shot this unarmed black kid, and then Michael Brown died as a result of being shot by an officer. So I put the work up, and I really kind of hope people would get it. And I followed it a little bit on social media because I'm anonymous. It was anonymous. And most people thought the redacted text meant that the New York Times had incorrect information to write, because we're in a time period of fake news, so to speak. And something interesting happened. People started to fight over the work. I want to say a month into it being on that wall, it was actually plastered over by some full moon party, full moon festival. And I wake up to all of these notes, and people are actually arguing and fighting with these people about coming into Bed-Stuy, right? It's become territorial. At some point, someone goes and actually peels it away and somehow maintains the kind of clear image of the bottom. And then this wall, if you can see that it's I think what's become really interesting about this is that a lot of people have said, hey, why are you putting it in Bed-Stuy? There's still a lot of black people there. This should be somewhere where white folks can see it. So I'm like, are we in the same Bed-Stuy? Because I see white people all over the place. Nostrand used to be a lot browner. But there's this interesting thing that happens where we're so externally focused that we kind of believe that resistance involves shifting the viewpoint of others, right? And one of the things that I've come to kind of understand, especially as I defend where I put the work, which is in many ways it's very much based on a wall like this, which I probably will not find in Park Slope, right? How long would a wall that looks like this last in Park Slope or Park Avenue, right? And so there's a lot being said there about how spaces are maintained depending on the race of the community and what the funding is there. And so this wall is a mess in terms of tagging. And so at some point it gets ordered that it would be cleaned, that the wall should be painted, and all of this graffiti, which has started to accumulate. If you look back to the first image, right, I love that somebody tagged news over there, that this should be cleaned. And this is what happens. And so we found, I don't get to track them that much, but I find several instances where the work is, there's an act of refusal. There's someone who's supposed to clean it up, who's decided they are not gonna do that. All right, so this is the one that's outside. And so this was a August 19th, 2016 article. This is about, if you look at the bottom, which is below the fold, accused of fabricating robbery, swimmers fuel tension in Brazil. So as a close-up, this is my redo of it, but this is exactly what is at the bottom of the paper, which is a distortion. And so I've worked through, this is what you would, if you were outside, this is for the most part what you would encounter. I think maybe there are a couple more edits that aren't on here. But I generally go through and I change the article and I make instructions for the next one. And so if you guys aren't familiar with this event, because the New York Times was making sure you weren't familiar with this event, Ryan Lochte and 3 other swimmers from the team vandalized a gas station and then lied and said that they were robbed. And that's front page news, right? It wasn't front page that day. Instead, Usain Bolt got the photo op. And so my revision, I make an adjustment. And so what I try to do with these is I'm trying to shift your gaze away from this to kind of what I believe there to be. There's a reality. And so that involves me kind of changing both the images and then also changing the language. And if you look at the title shift, I'm gonna go back one more time. It goes, accused of fabricating robbery, swimmers fuel tension in Brazil. And it moves on to Rio gas station footage reveals white American swimmers were offenders. And I'm really, I find it really important to kind of identify whiteness in my work. I think it operates invisibly. And at the bottom, I redact most of the text. And when I do this, just to kind of explain this to people who tend to think this is because this is false information, I'm forcing a viewpoint. And so there's one fact that I think is really buried through all this text about the lush life in Brazil and the warm temperatures, is that ultimately this is about white privilege. This is about a guy, a grown-up, who's referred to a kid, kind of utilizing what is a very enduring, I mean, I actually believed him at first, knowing kind of, the history of police in Brazil. So there's a way in which it's operating there that I found to be really critical to the work. And so this is the second counter-narrative, and this one's on the wall outside. And this is what it looks like outdoors. And so a big goal of this work was to try to figure out how to get communities to kind of collectively engage in acts of resistance, right? And so people are reviewing the text. People are actually writing me to ask me about certain uses of words. And so I think in that sense it's been pretty successful. This is the third one. I think this one is a really critical one given where we are at times. Thinking about in the Trump age, right? I think one of the things that's really shitty about having a year's worth of papers is that I still have the papers from when he was like running for president. And I need to keep them, but I seriously want to burn them. Anyway, this article appeared in the New York Times national section, still the A section, which is the major first part of the paper. Tulsa man accused of harassing Lebanese family is charged with murder. A suspect is said to have hit the victim's mother with a car. This is actually the New York Times piece. And so if you know the story about Vernon Majors, he harassed this family over years. The Lebanese family, as the Times calls them, lived in Oklahoma for 30 years. This guy lived there for 7, but for some reason they were calling him Tulsa Man. No one seemed to be able to get this title right, which is part of what I was talking to the Times about in terms of language and violence. This was the Lebanon news. Oklahoma man shoots dead filthy Lebanese neighbor. This was the Washington Post. They suddenly got afraid of the word racism. Man's unusual fixation with Lebanese neighbors led to killing, Tulsa police say. So the process, it involves a lot of me kind of, this one I'm marking for my own typos and weird errors, but I'm also trying to figure out how to render another version that can point out the racism and inconsistencies of the first version. And so that's a painstaking process, but I share it because I think this is part of what an editor's board looks like. And so ultimately I opted, and I don't think I can see it there, is after years of racism toward neighbors, white American man charged with murder. And the pull quote is changed from a suspect is said to have hit the victim's mother with a car to, he said the families, he called the family dirty Arabs. The Times, so I actually spoke to the Times about this particular piece, and they were, I want to use the word embarrassed because I feel like that's not a fair word, but I think some of the people who have been willing to engage me about the work, they're mostly colored people, and they see these issues, but they don't have control, right? There's a titles editor, there's a captions editor, there's all these people whose hands are in the pot. And so this is the final one that I'll share with you before. This one points to omission, right? This is me leaving kind of the main section of the paper. In July of this year, John McEnroe was featured on the front page of the sports section of the, for no reason, right? Other than he's an angry white man. Anyway, it actually was the day that Venus Williams played. She played in the finals, making her one of the oldest women to compete for a Grand Slam. But she was on the Thursday or Friday paper in a column in the interior of the paper in black and white next to a scoreboard. And if you actually see the top, the header of the paper is scoreboard. And so this is one that I just simply reoriented it to make it more visible. And so that's what that looks like. This one's not featured here, but a lot of people like this one, right? So the work is very much about trying to use the paper as a site of a type of resistance. And what's generally happened is that there's a lot of discussion about how angry the Times is about what I am doing for the work. But that's the goal of the Counternarratives project, is kind of zoom in on kind of these omissions and these language issues and try to kind of reorient them so I can say something else. All right, what's next? My upcoming projects actually get away from print media, but they still rely on the news. I'm working on an audio project that interrogates Black death in news media. I'm particularly interested in kind of the emergence of these kind of press conferences where parents and family members of shooting victims kind of go and make statements. And so I've been trying to tie those together to kind of see what the consistencies are in terms of language. Another project that I'm working on is a newspaper that explores Black liberatory practices, but it's set in the future. And I guess the third project is one that looks at the comparisons between the reporting of the Scottsboro Boys case and the Central Park Five. There's a ton of overlap there, so I'm trying to figure out a way artistically kind of tease that out. That's it.